And we're towards the bottom of page 25 in the text. So the Sixth Patriarch Hui Neng is continuing to respond to the request that was given by this prefect Wei. It says for further instruction. You remember he started out this whole talk with a very powerful opening statement, if you could take it, but an opening instruction, which is on page 7. And here really is the essence of his teaching. He says, good and wise friends, Bodhi is just the purity of your own nature. Attend only to this and you will straightway achieve Buddhahood. So, in that opening passage, he is not toning down his instruction in any way. There's a mixture of people here, but he just comes out, and it's sometimes called the sound of the hammer hitting steel. It's just very direct, very not staged or shaped. It's just right to the point, and basically telling them, attending to this, attending to your own mind, your own nature, is where it's all coming from. Everything stems from this. Now, in this passage here, he continues this theme when he says, and we'll read the passage, good and wise friends, prajna wisdom comes from one's own essential nature, does not come from outside. Do not make the mistake of using will and intellect. It is called, quote, the natural workings of the true nature. When the self-nature is true, everything else is true. So here, just as he says Bodhi, the state of awakening or the unimpeded awakened mind is right within your own capacity, he says too, and you'll see this theme throughout, wisdom, compassion, prajna, even the moral sensibility, all of this he holds to be innate, essential to one's own being. It's whole and complete. And the only difference between manifesting it or making it real and not is not a difference of capacity between one person and another, even between a Buddha and an ordinary living being. It's a matter of function or application or use. Chinese Jung. In other words, if you use it and use it well, it is the functioning of an enlightened being, a sage. And if you don't use it well, its capacity hasn't diminished, you're just not using it to its fullest. So this is an important teaching here, because prajna, again at this time, is often seen as a mystical understanding or something that's almost transcendent beyond the reach of the ordinary. And here he's putting it right within the ordinary. He says it's actually very ordinary. It doesn't come from the outside. It exists within your own nature. Because we neglect it, because we do not use our capacity fully, it then seems to be far out, remote, transcendent, and out of reach. But he said it's not that it's distant at all. It's right within our own lives, except we get confused, we cover it over, and especially he's going to say, beyond this, we shrink this capacity, or you could use the term, we collapse this capacity into a kind of pettiness. And the more we collapse it, the more that fullness cannot manifest, but it doesn't go away. It's almost, in some sense, pulsing to get out. And often the tension in our lives that we feel, but we can't always articulate, is this confused, muddled collapsing that's going on. And while we're doing it, we know we're doing it, but we can't stop. And then this pulsing capacity to break out of that container. And it often feels like an unresolved tension. We feel as if we're meant to be and do something else. We're meant to be or do something, perhaps let's use the word greater or more expansive or more meaningful than what we are, but we find ourselves day after day going to bed at night and saying, I didn't, I wish. What? And this tension persists and persists. And it's not necessarily a destructive tension, it can be constructive. Something that wishes to be born, there's something that wishes to come out. And why I express it that way is that that's what he means by don't seek for it outside, it's within. It's seeking to want this fullness of life. And the only difference why it isn't coming out is this unresolved tension of what we're doing, what our priorities are, and what our vision is of our human capacity. If we shrink that vision down, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We actually become what we imagine, what we fear, what we think, and what we narrow ourselves down to. And then at a certain point, we can't imagine that we could be any other way. But in fact, he's saying, no, this is the prajna of wisdom. It's within your own nature. And he says it's the natural workings of the true mind. This is a really important phrase. It's not supernatural. It's not beyond the everyday. It's not beyond our normal human capacities. And that's why this particular type of wisdom he's talking about isn't of the first kind even necessarily. It's not the literary prajna that comes from erudition and study. And nor is it even contemplative prajna that comes only when one is meditating. But this is actually what they call true or genuine real mark prajna, which is a universal capacity that all beings have, regardless of intelligence, gender, social and economic status, education, or anything like this. So he says it's the natural workings. It means this mind is available to all beings, and it's natural, it's innate. It can manifest in children, or it can manifest in old, or vice versa, or across that range. So again, by saying it's the natural workings of the true nature, what he means, again, let it happen in and of itself, just as he says, let the mind be unattached. He doesn't say, make your mind unattached, or try to attain non-attachment. He says, let it be unattached, clinging to nothing. That is that true emptiness that's just a wonderful existence. And here he's saying, let your mind be unencumbered. Don't shrink and collapse it, and this prajna will just not naturally manifest. So, the next line says, the mind has the capacity for great things. It's not meant to behave in petty ways. Ooh. Do not talk about emptiness all day long, but fail to cultivate it in your mind. So here he's making 2 points. First of all, he's saying that the mind, the human mind, and we're not just talking about the brain, we're talking about the mind, the whole of consciousness, has a capacity for great things. And in fact, he'll say it has the capacity for all the wisdom of a Buddha. Its function is to know and understand clearly in all. Its function is to be happy, unattached, unbound, liberated, and have all these wondrous, incredible qualities. That's its capacity. It is not meant, not designed to behave in petty ways. So if it's behaving in petty ways, we're working against the design. It's that simple. Now, the next thing he says, however, this is not something you just talk about. You actually have to do something. You have to cultivate that mind. Otherwise, it stays collapsed, it stays covered over, it stays undeveloped, assuming that we got it to that point. Okay, now, of course, if your mind is, like he says, always in prajna, then there's no need to cultivate. You know, that was remember I gave you the thing last week when someone asked my teacher, well, my mind is always in emptiness, why do I need to cultivate? And his answer was, if your mind's truly in emptiness, why do you need to ask? And so that's hitting at that, talking with the mouth but not really doing it. He said, and he gives a parallel here, that would be like a commoner, next page, proclaiming himself king of the country. How absurd. So he's saying to talk about it and not to manifest, not to really do it, is basically similar to, you could say, a cab driver saying, by the way, you recognize me? I'm the President of the United States. I'm just in disguise today. And we'd say, well, that's absurd. He's not the President of the United States. And he's saying, talking about prajna but not doing it is the same gap, the same divide. How absurd this could never be. Then he makes another strong statement. Well, such people are not my disciples. Now, he doesn't mean this, I don't think, in the sense of he's dismissing or rejecting disciples or students. He's saying, you're not following my teaching if you do it this way. My teaching is to really do it and not just simply to talk about it. So by means my disciples is, you're not of my school, you're not of this persuasion. It's not a personal thing he's saying. He's saying, really, you're outside the way. Because the way comes from within the mind. Yes?
Marty, is there some irony here that he was a commoner and he was sort of proclaimed the king of a certain country, as it were?
Well, it would be a very strange irony. I don't think that's what he's saying here so much, that he was a commoner and became a king. I think his point more along those lines would be, if indeed you accept and acknowledge what the previous patriarch has said, that somehow I've realized this, then he's saying you can truly believe that this is universal. This is available to everyone because I have become. And so I don't think he's reversing and saying I'm a commoner who claimed to be proclaimed king, but rather he's saying this is universal, but you can't just pretend to be it. You actually have to. So a commoner can become king and a king become commoner, but it's all based on your action, not on your imagination or even your pretensions.
Or your will.
Well, yes. Did we do that one already?
We talked a little bit about will. Yeah.
Did we get it? Oh, yeah. Mistake of using will?
Right.
I brushed over that. And again, here it's in contrast to not only that, the will, but it's also in contrast to the natural. So when he says it's natural, it means it should happen in a rather easy, spontaneous way once you're removing the covers over it. And by this he's saying the action then in the practice and the cultivation is to take away that which is obstructing, but not leave the obstructions there and then use your will to sort of push and think I can get it through willpower, or I can get it through the intellect. I can get it through the, sort of just intellectual erudition and reasoning, or I can get it by a kind of forceful will activity. He's saying, actually, you don't get it by going after it. It is manifest by letting go. So relaxing the will and relaxing this drivenness that we have, and then at the same time quieting the busy, mad mind that wants to own and possess it as it's some sort of theoretical philosophy. Let both of those go, and it manifests by itself. But those two activities, will and intellect, strangulate it. Yet they think they're getting it. So it's a really interesting passage. He said, so, it's not meant to be in petty ways, don't talk about every day, da-da-da-da. The pettiness he's talking about, too, I mean, there's so many levels we could talk about this. At one level, it's similar to what we did some time ago with Thoreau. Do you remember Thoreau? Some of you here, Henry David Thoreau, an American iconoclast, philosopher, dropout, ne'er-do-well, famous poet, all those things. He was a student of Emerson's. When he graduated from Harvard, he didn't go set up a company, and the company he would have set up was making and selling pencils. That was his father's business. And he did that for a while and thought, whoa, this is fun. And so he stopped and he went into a retreat at a place called Walden Pond. And he wanted to really let his mind expand to its full capacity. He didn't want to behave in petty ways. He said, I see the mass of men around me leading lives of quiet desperation. They've sold their souls and their bodies to their jobs, to their careers, to small pieces of property and investments and loans and mortgages. And he said, I just see that they're taking the best thing of their whole being in life and just letting it, be weighted down under these things that matter nothing. And when your life is over, you can say, what did I do? What did I accomplish? So he wanted to address this before he got old. And so he has a tone here of let your mind expand and be the fullness that it could be instead of prematurely shrinking it down. So that's one example. You could sort of talk about it's just talking about what we do with our lives. But it can also be a very internal state. For example, you can be seen to be doing great and important things, but actually in the internal state, it's a very petty state. It's calculating benefit and loss. It's constant jealousy and envy and fighting with other people, even though it looks like you're involved. You could be a great politician, for example, but inside, it's a constant state of petty calculations, petty slights, petty objections, and so on and so forth. And so there's a tension between the seemingly greatness of what you're doing, but the internal. So you can't just measure it by some external accomplishment, but it has to be really, again, he's saying internally what's going on. Is the capacity of your mind really great? Is it really open? Is it expansive? Are you inclusively embracing all of humanity? Or do you have all these narrow little sectarian, ethnocentric, bias, prejudice categories where everything's categorized and put into these things? That's the pettiness. And so he says by doing that, even though externally you may be cool, inside you're living in a very small, petty world. There's a wonderful, I don't know if it's called wonderful, it's an interesting poem. I was thinking by a poet named T.S. Eliot. You know T.S. Eliot? Yeah, he's kind of hard to read. It's not like Hickory Dickory Dock. But he's got some interesting ideas. And this one that I was thinking about, when he said petty ways, I immediately thought of it's called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is a funny title for a poem, because it's not really a love song, it's a lament. But in the poem, this person, Prufrock, and the name just says Prufrock, he's very he's sold his life out to pettiness, okay? And now he's wondering, and the poem starts where he says, I'm getting old, and he's having a reflection. But the question is he really getting old, or is he just getting old in spirit? So this is, because my poetry teacher was doing this, said, he may be an old man, or he may be just old in spirit. He may have died at 16, but he'd be buried at 70. Boo. Sort of saying you at 16 or 20 or whatnot, you stop fully living, but then you go on in this sort of drift until you're 60, and then you're 70, then you're buried. But all that interval in between is flat. So in the poem, he's contemplating, he says, I grow old. Shall I wear my trousers rolled? I mean, this is the pettiness. And let me see, how shall I put my trousers on today? Shall I roll them up? Grow old, shall I wear my trousers rolled? Shall I part my hair behind? Should I part it this way or that? But this is like the epitome of pettiness. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? He's thinking, now I have to really watch my diet. My diet is very important. So then the pettiness is my diet. Today I have a peach, but that might be too much, so tomorrow I do this micro life he lives in. Shall I wear my flannel trousers when I walk upon the beach? Or should I wear other, because I'm going to catch a cold, blah, blah, blah. This is like this little world, and he says, I've heard the mermaids singing each to each, but I don't think they'll sing to me. Which is this lament of the wonder of life is gone. There's no mermaids in his life anymore. And even though he knows they're not singing to him. And then this beautiful line, he says, I've measured out my life in coffee spoons. And this one line really captures that sort of sense of the fullness and wholeness of your being is now shrunk down to these little petty rituals and routines, ruts that we have made for ourselves and then continue to go through. And it's not just necessarily, because you can do something that's routine. You see, this isn't it. It's about a state of mind. You can do something that's ordinary and routine, but still have a greatness about it. So it's not in the activity per se, it's in the state of mind. That's why my poetry teacher is saying, really it's not his age, because it's his spirit. If he had the right spirit, then getting old would just be wonder, from wonder, as Lao Tzu said, from wonder to wonder existence opens. So it's the opposite of that. Okay, a digression. Let's go back. He says, good and wise friends, what is prajna? In our language, why does he say in our language? Anybody? English, he meant. Because he was lecturing this in English. And then later it was translated into Chinese. He means, obviously, prajna is not a Chinese term and not an English term. It is a Sanskrit term, right? He says, in our language, prajna means, and then he would probably say, I think this is hui or zhihui, wisdom. Zhihui, yeah. So the Chinese for this is zhihui. And it involves a penetrating knowledge, not just a knowledge of the way the world works or something, but this is dhyana, this is direct knowledge of the deeper way things are. And he says, means wisdom. Now, it's very interesting, he says, in every place and in every moment, in thought after thought, never becoming muddled and constantly acting wisely. This is just practicing prajna. So he goes back and he says, first of all, I'm going to tell you, it is not something that you get, nor is it something you even just talk about. It's very natural. It's in the natural workings of your unimpeded mind. And now he defines it further. He says, prajna is something you do. Wow. Prajna is something that you do. It's not something you have or attain. And it's measured moment to moment, thought and thought. So in a sense, it's not attained, but it's maintained. It's a dynamic quality of equilibrium and balance and insight in every moment of thought. So that doesn't mean just in everything you do, but it's in that inner world that you're going and your reaction and perceptions to things. Is this balanced? Is this whole? Are you sinking into pettiness? Are you moving off center? And then this is not a bad word for it, to be constantly on center, in the center of unattached, unbound, liberated mind. Therefore, you turn and you move and you flow with conditions and respond without ever losing that equilibrium. But it's not measured in a static attainment, but rather a dynamic maintaining. So this is another way of looking. That's why it's very interesting. He says this is called practicing prajna. And it's defined not by any particular virtue achievement. It's defined by the opposite. It's just actions that are not muddled, thoughts that are not muddled. And so it's sort of like, it might appear to be nothing then. You see what I'm saying? It's like, somebody's got wisdom. How do you know? Well, listen to the thunder, see the lightning, look at their great deeds. No, it might be absolutely markless. It might be artless. It might have nothing to it, because in that situation, it's appropriate, because it's not muddled. And so it has to do with, it's not like hyperaction, nor is it a blank stillness, but it's appropriate action to the situation where it's called. And that's markless. And sometimes in another tradition it's called wu wei. And wu wei doesn't mean not doing, it means doing without will or intellect and this hyper-intentionality. It means responding and doing things. And that's why it says someone who is wu wei gets things done without doing. Without doing, everything gets done. This meaning, it's like it's totally right on. And so the mark of wisdom is nothing special. And yet it seems to be not a lot of mistakes going on here. Not a lot of flaws. Not a lot of marks of anger or frustration or over, scheming and planning and calculating or manipulating. And so you can see this quality in someone. It's not something you can pretend, but someone who has this prajna is just always active, appropriately, always aware, as the text says, always still but observing everywhere. Everywhere observing, yet forever still. It's this kind of quality. And so it's very natural, very at ease. It's almost like sometimes they say, the wind blows and the tree responds. It's this kind of thing. The tree doesn't anticipate, and after the wind's gone, the tree doesn't keep shaking or say, well, it's this natural thing, right? The clouds come and they move and the shadows move around. It's this natural flow because it's the natural workings of the true mind. And that's why when he says it in this way, you realize, well, then what's the manifestation of wisdom? It's like the oracle, this, sort of massively ornate person that you go to for great advice or something. No, it's right in this ordinary selflessness. So my teacher once said, someone who has genuine prajna is markless. And he says they're not marked by craving or thirst. It's not pulsing through them. They're not marked by fighting and competitiveness and contention and striving. They're not marked by selfishness. They act and respond, but it's never by a selfish motive. They're not marked by constantly seeking for self-gain, self-aggrandizement, self-benefit. And he said, finally, there's no deceptive quality about a person who has wisdom. It's absolutely transparent and clear. What you see is what's there. There's no guile, and not even self-deception. I have an older friend who I have tea with every once. I told you about him. He's a retired philosopher. And he wrote a book that's really incredible. And basically, it's called Self-Deception. And the argument in his book is it's not possible. It's an oxymoron. You cannot self-deceive yourself. So you think about that. So he said self-deception is actually impossible. Because deception implies some intentionality. If you're intentionally deceiving yourself, you're already aware that you're deceiving yourself, so it can't be self-deception. Okay. Then he goes on, he says, when with one deluded thought, prajna is cut off, however. Here's the dynamic again. With one wise thought, prajna thinks back to life. So the wise and the deluded are this almost like a teeter-totter back and forth, and these determine whether there's wisdom or delusion. Ordinary people, muddled and confused, fail to recognize prajna. So here he's not only saying fail to practice it, fail to recognize it. They don't know how it functions. We're so accustomed to acting out of will, intellect, scheming, and these sort of constant cause-benefit things. To act naturally in this way seems to us unnatural. And sometimes seems foolish. You've got to be careful here. Because this idea, again, going back to my teacher's thing, he said, to be a great sage, you first have to be a big dummy. And what he meant by that is, there's a kind of, when you're this way, when you're really true to yourself, and he's saying, remember, when the self-nature is true, everything else is true. So when you're true in this way, really attentive to these stirrings, these proper stirrings within you, you can easily be seen as a bumbling loser from the point of view of the world, because you're not smart, you're not just getting ahead. In some ways, you might be behind, depending on what measuring stick you use. But again, in terms of these marks, this marklessness, you're there. But this is not what always is praised or held up or given prizes and trophies. Often the opposite is. So, again, you have to be careful here in interpreting this to think, someone who doesn't look like they're could in fact be very well. I'm not saying they are, but it's not for sure that success is a measurement of wisdom, at least on this side of success. He says their mouths talk about prajna, but their minds are confused. They are forever saying, I cultivate prajna. And though they talk on and on about emptiness, they have no idea of its true meaning. Prajna has no shape or form. And here we go back to the markless again. It is only the mind of wisdom. If you understand it in this way, just this is prajna wisdom. So this brings it full circle. He takes something that seems to be very abstruse and profound and brings it right down to the ordinary and to the everyday activities, and that would be the marker, the measurement of that. So one of the ways you would take stock of this is to actually do the inventory of your thoughts, your feelings, on especially what we call the klesha, the afflictions, and to see to what extent those are dominant or recessive in your day-to-day state of mind and action. And it's actually a very concrete way of measuring this. If the craving is up, if the aversion, anger, the love-hate thing is going strong, if our actions are producing all the results we hope they wouldn't, and the ones we hope they would are not happening, if there is a constant stirring of, and that goes to scatteredness, uncontrolled mouth karma, gossiping, divisive speech, talking behind, deceptiveness at all levels. All of these are markers whether prajna is operating or not. It's not like it's mystical. You can actually take stock. And when prajna starts to reach this very natural state, there's an at ease, it's called zidzai, that happens in the person. And that's why you have the image of Guanyin Bodhisattva called Guanzizai. I don't think we have, do we have any Guanzizai? If you have one, you probably keep it at home because it's so cool. There's some really good ones. Doug has one that he got, it's from Hawaii. That's a really good one. I have one of those at home. I don't see if we have any. Guanzizai, oh, I'm going to imitate Guanzizai. But Guanzizai is Guanyin Bodhisattva, not me. And Guanyin Bodhisattva is sitting like this. Sort of. So one knee is up, and the arm is just resting here. The hand is usually open, and there's this movement and stillness look, like the eyes are somewhat open and somewhat closed. The face is somewhat in meditation, but very available. And it's sort of like Guanyin's going like, what's up? Okay? What's happening? And so it's the engaged bodhisattva. And Guanzizai means contemplating at ease. And so it's, that's kind of like it there. That's, is that Manjushri? Universal worthy. It's a similar posture, but when you see a Guanzizai image, it's really striking because it's this in the world, not of the world, in prajna stillness, and yet totally engaged in interacting. It's a beautiful image of these two. And the line that goes along with it is this. The bodhisattva, because of wisdom, does not linger in samsara, but because of compassion, doesn't dwell in nirvana. And it's this, that's the Guanzizai, tension there. So it's like nowhere attached, yet everywhere engaged, and manifesting prajna in the relaxed zizai. Seeking nothing, fearing nothing, just there. Very cool. Very cool. So, tonight I was going to share a little story with you, because I like to do stories. And although you've heard the story before, it's really appropriate. It's not a personal story, but it's a story my teacher used to tell. And it illustrates about talking prajna as opposed to the real thing. And so we mentioned before, there's traditionally three kinds of prajna, which are, anybody remember? Literary. Contemplative, meditative prajna. And true mark or real prajna, the real thing that you don't have to study to get, and you don't even have to meditate to be in. You're there all the time. So that's the real mark one. So, but at certain times, especially in Chinese history, around the school of meditation and Chan, and those that were seeking awakening in prajna, there developed a literary kind of style, very ornate. So instead of going to Pete's Coffee and sort of talking about politics, people outside would be writing little poems about their states of awakening, and they would be talking about the eternal verities rather than, the stock market. And so this became very popular. And some poets were better at this than others. So the one I'm talking about tonight is someone called Sudong Po. And Sudong Po was I believe, Sung Dynasty. And he was born around a little after 1000 something, 1030 or something when he was born, during the Sung Dynasty, which is after the Sixth Patriarch. So he comes after him. And he would have known about these teachings undoubtedly, and certainly the Chan school. And I really like him. I like him as a poet. Even though this is a story that's not particularly flattering to him, I think he's really cool. One of the reasons I think he's cool is because he got in trouble a lot with officials, authority. He had a way of writing that got under the skin of people in positions of power and status. And so much so that he was imprisoned, and he was exiled 12 times. But if you're a great poet, you can be brought back 12 times too. So obviously they couldn't live without him, and they couldn't live with him. And so this was his, and he particularly did not hold his tongue in satire. So he'd often write satirical poems. And often this is the worst affront to power. If you threaten to dethrone them or take them out by assassination, they can deal with that. But mock them, and they become powerless. And so the most powerful form of political change or persuasion is not even the ballad. It's often mockery, satire, humor, and a good poem. And so Sudong Po had this, but of course it got him in trouble. In any event, some people consider him the greatest of the Sung Dynasty poets. One of the reasons I like him is because his language and his approach is very simple, and yet it's extremely profound too. He wrote in a vein that brought in Taoist and Buddhist elements into his poetry, even though he was brought up in Confucian. And by that I mean his poetry had things of nature in it, very detailed, concrete things of nature. But he would use the smallest, minute things of nature to reveal the larger universal truths. So in his poetry, you would see reflected these universal truths, and then the universal would be manifested in and through his poetry. Let me read you a short one to give you an idea of both how he uses concrete and then at the same time conveying Buddhist and Taoist themes. So what are Buddhist and Taoist themes? To get a good job, get a good education. Oh, good. I'm glad there's some humor here. No, that's not a Taoist theme nor a Buddhist theme. The more you have, the happier you'll be. No. Always wanting more, a sign of true success imminent. No. Okay, none of these. So it has to do with chilling out, pulling out from the illusory world, withdrawing from a world of hedonistic senses, finding one's true self, listening to the heart, and attuning with nature and attuning with the Tao and tuning with your own nature. All of this is that theme. So here's one of his poems. He says, very short, "To what can our life on earth be likened?" Is his first line. It's a question. To what can our life on earth be likened? He says, to a flock of geese. A flock of geese alighting on the snow, sometimes leaving a trace of their passing. Now, it's just a very simple poem, but get the drift of it. He says, and so what the Taoists and Buddhists do is they try to, what I say, strip away the coverings over the prajna, which is often our pretensions of importance and bigness and whatnot. Petty ways means it's all about me. I know you're all here, but it's really about me. You're all little satellites revolving around me that orbit the planet. And so that's a petty mind. So what he says, to what can our life on earth be likened? Whoa, right away he's framing our life on earth. You're already like small with that. No, my life in Berkeley. No, your life on earth. Already the planet shrinks your size. To a flock of geese, who's, how do you say, alighting on the snow, sometimes leaving a trace of their passing. Pretty cool. So this is one of his poems. So writing like this, he's definitely had a literary prajna, and it was recognized. So the story goes that he had a friend, a Dharma master, a Chan Dharma master, whose name was Fu Ying. And Fu Ying lived on one side of the Yangtze River, and Sudam Po lived on the other side of the Yangtze River. But they had a friendship, and they would visit each other frequently, so frequently that they wouldn't have to announce when they were coming. Now, that's real friends. Real friends can arrive unannounced, and everything's good. Not always. We won't go into that. And so one day he goes over to Fu Ying's place, and Fu Ying's not there. And of course he goes into Fu Ying's study and just sort of hanging out. There's different versions of this. This is a version, I remember my teacher telling. And he's hanging out, and Fu Ying's not there, and he says, "Oh, I'll be a little mischievous today. I will take some of his paper and his calligraphy brush, and I'll write a poem here and just leave it in his studio here. So when he comes back, he'll see it and think, wonder who did this profound poem." So this is how he was playful. And so I don't know the exact words of the poem, but it was because Fu Ying was a Chan master. Sudam Po decided, I think I'll share with him my state of meditative, contemplative prajna. And so the poem went something like this. Here I sit atop my purple golden lotus, something like solid and serene. Not even the eight winds can move me or even make me lean. And so what the eight winds, anybody know what the eight winds are? It's not talking about forces of nature, it's talking about gain and loss. So those are two. Fame, fame and insult. So fame and insult. Praise and ridicule. Those are 6. And then sorrow and joy. So these are considered to be the vicissitudes of life that move people all the time. We get insulted, we're really upset, we get a little fame, it's like, well, bring it on, bring it on. Same with gain and loss. Now sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes loss makes us happy and gain is the other way around. So it's not that gain is always happy and loss is the opposite, right? So if you lose a relationship, it might be a gain. So, but every way you look at it, okay? So this is what he writes, and he says, none of these can move me. Move is tung, meaning cause me to stir off my equanimity. I am impartial, even, solid, unmoving. And so, and leaves it, and he goes back over. Now, of course, he's not totally unattached because he's thinking, I wonder if he found it. I wonder if he found it, what he thought of it, and so on and so forth. I bet he thought it was good because that's really cool, it's like da-da-da-da-da. And so Hui Neng apparently comes back, takes a look at it, gets this little smile on his face because he's also mischievous, and he writes down 2 characters on the poem, folds it up, gives it to his attendant, and sends it back across the Yangtze River to Sudampo. So Sudampo is out there in his garden, not being moved by the 8 winds, but thinking, who's that coming with this message? Oh, it's my poem. And so he says, thank you, thank you. And he opens it up, and he reads the poem again, not the 8 winds can move me around. And at the bottom it says, fart, fart. And then Hui Neng signed his name. And so immediately, his face got red, his neck veins bulged out, and he got so upset he said, saddle my horse, I'm going over to Hui Neng's place. And so he got on his horse and not just trotted, but galloped across the bridge, across the river, breaks into Hui Neng's study and says, are you blind? Can't you see I only care for the Dharma, for the Tao? And Hui Neng smiled, he says, I do see, he said. Now, how did you put it? Serene and unmoving, not even the 8 winds could stir you, and yet 2 farts blew you all the way across the river. And so, this is the story of Sudampo. Now, yes, indeed, he was a great poet, but the point is that it was a literary project, not the real thing. And the real test was, in thought after thought, moment to moment, can you be thus, thus? Well, no, just on paper. So it's not really the prajna wisdom that he's talking about. Okay, so I love the story. We'll stop there for tonight and continue this next week. Any announcements need to be made? Nothing? Yes?
This Sunday, March 1st, they're having an all-day Amitabha meditation here.
Okay, and what does that consist of?
It's really slow walking.
It doesn't mean Amitabha's reciting all day long, it's mean you're reciting.
They're reciting.
It's slow walking?
Yeah, slow walking, slow chanting. Yeah, that's right. All of your yes. You just recite Amitabha's name and keep walking.
Okay, with that cheerleading introduction. Okay, let's do the transference in English. May it revealing our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may their minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of their endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassion Ling Li San Bao.
Huh?